Over the course of the next few lessons, I want to show you how to create new documents and navigate inside your open files and all that good stuff. But before we get to that, I want to show you how you can go about customizing the Photoshop interface. In the previous exercises, you saw how to get around inside the interface. We did that interface tour. Now I want to show you how to kind of make the interface your own. And, the more comfortable you get with Photoshop, the easier it's going to be to really customize the interface and really make it your own. So in this exercise, I'll show you how to customize things up, and then I'll also show you workspaces in just a short while as well. And we'll see how we can create our own workspaces and change Photoshop's workspaces and all that good stuff. So to get started, I think what I'll do is I'll start customizing my interface by rearranging some of my palettes. And earlier I said that some of the palettes you'll use all the time, other palettes you'll use, every once in a while, and there's other palettes that you may never use at all. And we talked about closing palettes and things like this. But what I didn't show you is how to go about customizing your palettes. So quite literally, what I can do is I can take any palette tab where it actually reads the palette name there, for example, character or paragraph or swatches, and I can grab that tab, just click on it and drag it straight out into the middle of the screen, literally tear it away from the interface. And now, rather than having a docked palette, I now have a floating palette, and this palette can be moved around on screen just by dragging on this top bar here, this top gray bar. So maybe I want character to appear down in the bottom left corner, for example. And maybe what I'll do is I'll make sure that the paragraph palette also sits within the character palette group. In other words, the two palettes are going to sit together. How would I do that? Well, I'm simply going to take the paragraph palette tab, again, where it reads paragraph there, and I'll grab that and I'll drag them away. I'll tear them away, and then I'll literally drop them inside the character palette. And you see that blue frame, that blue rectangle that shows up. That tells me that I'm about to drop the paragraph palette into the character palette group. And as soon as I let go, that's the result that I get. So quite literally, that's the idea here. We can take any of our palettes here, we can tear them away from the docked group of palettes there on the right-hand side. We can always drop them back into the right-hand side if we want. Again, just wait for that blue frame, or move your mouse around a little bit until you see that blue frame showing up. I could drop swatches down into the layers palette group if I want, something like that. Or maybe what I could do is I could just have the swatches palette floating on its own, maybe in the top left here. Or I could dock the swatches palette, or any palette really, over onto the left-hand side, over with the toolbox if I want. So I could drag this guy over, again, until I see that blue indicator there. In this case, it's a vertical blue line. Let go of my mouse, and now swatches is now docked over onto the left-hand side, something like this. And again, I have that white arrow there, so I can expand and collapse my swatches palette there if I want. So maybe what I'll do is I'll do just a little bit of customization here. I'll drop character and paragraph in there with swatches. So now they're all grouped here on the left-hand side. Again, now I just have this column of icons here. Maybe back over on the right-hand side, I'll take my channels palette, and maybe I'll close out of him, and I'll take styles, and I'll close out of that guy, and maybe take info and drag him down with layers and paths, maybe something like that, right? So again, it's really up to you. You can really set up your interface however you want. And I'm really just kind of giving you the basics here, but as always, you might want to pause things up here and spend a little bit of time customizing the interface. And again, if you're brand new to Photoshop, it might take a little bit of time to kind of get used to which palettes you'll use all the time and which palettes you won't really be using a lot. But anyway, that's sort of the idea here, customizing the Photoshop interface. Now, as you can see, I kind of made a mess of my Photoshop interface. So let me show you some cool things here, and I want to sort of touch on something called Workspaces here inside Photoshop as well. And this is a little bit new inside Photoshop CS5, at least the way that it's handled here inside Photoshop CS5. So I am inside what's referred to as the Design Workspace, and that's sort of the default workspace here inside Photoshop. Now, how do I know that I'm on the Design Workspace? Well, right here, towards the top right anyway, I'm on the Design there, and it's selected there for me. I didn't click on that. That's what was set for me already, but in the the previous exercise, you and I rearranged some of the Photoshop palettes, and things are a bit of a mess now. So what I want to do is I want to take myself all the way back to where you and I started before we started moving the palettes around. So to do that, what I'll do is just towards the right of design, we have painting, and then we have this drop-down menu here. I'm going to click on this guy. And this reveals some additional Photoshop workspaces, which we'll get to. But the command that I'm going to choose is reset design. And what that will do is that'll take me all the way back to where you and I started. So all the palettes sort of rearrange themselves and put themselves back to where you and I began, which is great. So you can always go back and reset things, which is awesome. Now, that said, I thought what I would do is I thought I would take just a moment and show you how I usually rearrange the Photoshop workspace when I'm working on my own personal projects. And again, my thinking behind this is, again, for those who have not really worked a lot with Photoshop, it's kind of tough to know which palettes you'll use all the time and which ones you won't really use all that often. So I'll kind of give you a sense of at least how I like to work. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to tear away the character palette and the paragraph palette. And what I'll do is I'll close those guys just by clicking on the X in the top corner there. Go ahead and close out of those guys. I don't really use styles either. So I'm going to drag styles out and I'll close him as well. I do like swatches. I do like info as well. I use that guy quite a bit. And I use my layers, my channels, and my paths palettes all the time as well. Now, what I'm going to do as well is up towards the top here, we have this column of additional icons here. We saw this earlier. I'll just expand that out. And we have a new palette here inside Photoshop CS5 called Mini Bridge. Now, I think what I'll do is I'll tear him away and I'll close out of him for now at least. And then we have another palette here called History. Now, I use History all the time, and I'll show you History in just a little while. He's what I refer to as the Uber undo. So if you know about undoing in some of your other applications, stepping back through various steps and so on. That's what History is all about. So I'm going to drag this guy, and I'll drop him into the Swatches palette group, something like this. Okay, so I think that looks good. This is kind of a rough layout of how I normally work. I'm just going to head up to the window menu here for a moment. Now, I think for now, I'll leave my workspace, my customized interface exactly the way it is. But later on, we'll be getting into, for example, we'll be getting into the histogram palette, we'll be getting into the masks palette, and a few others as well. Definitely our adjustments palette as well. There's tons of palettes in here, but I think for sort of everyday Photoshop use, these are the palettes that I use sort of on an ongoing basis. So again, we have swatches, info, history, layers, channels, and paths. Okay, so that's a great place to begin here. So the next thing that I want to do with you is I want to go and save up this customized interface. I want to save my own custom workspace. So to do that, what I'll do is I'll head back to this drop-down menu that we found here in the top right corner. And this time I'm going to go down to New Workspace. Go ahead and choose that option there. And we're presented here with this New Workspace dialog box. I'm just going to call this Jeff's Workspace. You can call your workspace whatever you want. And as a quick aside, for the last 5 years or so, I've used laptops exclusively because, you know, when I'm on the road, I love having a machine with me, but when I get home or when I get to the office, I plug my laptop into my much larger monitor, right? I have a 21-inch monitor that I do most of my work on. Well, what's great about this is I actually have, in the real world, I could have Jeff's workspace on the road and Jeff's workspace at the office. So in other words, I get to the office, I plug everything in, and then I just switch my workspace over to my office workspace, which is obviously a much larger workspace that I work inside, right? Just a neat idea for you anyway. So in any regard, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Save here. That saves up my workspace. You can see at the top here now I'm inside Jeff's workspace. Now what's fantastic here is at this point I can now flip Photoshop between the various workspaces that we have saved already. So for example, I could switch over to Essentials, and that gives me sort of the bare bones Photoshop here. Or I could drop down this menu and I could go into Painting if I wanted to. And once again, that's going to switch over Photoshop's interface. Now I have my brush presets palette, for example, open there. We've got some other palettes available as well. There's my brushes palette. There's the mini bridge and then history as well. Or I could drop down this menu and I could go all the way back to design, which is back on the workspace that you and I had set up, which we saved as our own workspace, Jeff's workspace. So I'm going to drop down this menu one more time and I'll say reset design. And that takes us all the way back to where we started, right? But again, what's cool here is I can go back to Jeff's workspace, and that takes me back to the workspace that you and I just saved. So I hope all this makes sense. All we're doing really is just saving customized interface layouts, if that makes sense. And one more quick note here. You can use this drop-down menu if you want. You can explore through the different workspaces if you wish. Or what you can do is you can head up to the window menu at the top, and then down to workspace. And we have the exact same menu, essentially. There's our design and painting, and I could reset Jeff's workspace. I could delete a workspace if I wanted to, and so on. So that's really the idea here. So go ahead and create your own custom workspace. If you haven't done so already, make sure to save them up there as well. Let's spend the next few minutes taking a look at Photoshop's preferences. So if you're on the Windows side, head to your Edit menu. If you're on the Mac, as I am, head to your Photoshop menu, and then look for Preferences, and then choose General. Or what you can do is, on the Windows side there, you can hit Control-K, or here on the Mac, we could hit Command-K if you want. And that'll bring you into Photoshop's General Preferences dialog box, this dialog box here. Now, what I'm not going to do, and I hope you're not disappointed here, is what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to go through every single option in excruciating, nauseating detail. What I will do is I'll perhaps point out some highlights, and maybe what will wind up happening is as we work along through the series together, we might come back into the preferences and we might adjust a few things. But I just kind of want to give you a general idea of how the preferences are arranged here inside Photoshop. And this is a fresh installation of Photoshop CS5 that I'm working with, so hopefully everything should be pretty much standard here. Okay, so I'm inside the Preferences dialog box. You can see running down the left-hand side, we have all of our different categories. So we're inside General, of course. We have Interface and File Handling and Performance and so on. We'll take a quick look at each of these categories, and I'll point out a few things inside each category. So, starting off inside General, the color picker. When we start working with color inside Photoshop, the default is to use the Adobe color picker, which I would highly recommend you stick with. I can also, here on the Mac, choose the Apple color picker, or I'm sure on the Windows side you could use the Windows color picker, but just make sure you're set to Adobe there. It's much more flexible. And then below that, we have some additional options here. We have resize image during paste or place, for example, or use the Shift key for tools, which you saw that earlier when I was giving you the tour of the toolbox there. We held down the Shift key and we clicked on our tools to flip through our tools. We have animated zoom. We have the zoom resizes windows. We haven't talked about zooming yet, but these are just some different zoom options that we have. Now, I think what I'll do here is I'm going to leave all the defaults here. We also have another very important option, our image interpolation. And I think this already came up once for us, interpolation or resampling. And I certainly don't want to go off the deep end with you here right off the bat early on in our time here together. But this is going to play a key role when we start resizing our images. So remember where this guy is. This one's kind of important. Okay, let's take a look at the interface screen here. I could either click on interface here on the left-hand side, by the way, or I could simply click on the next button way over here on the right-hand side, and that just simply takes me down to the next screen, which is kind of cool. So here inside the interface screen, we can obviously set our interface options, our standard screen mode, which is gray, our full screen mode with menus, which is gray, full screen, which is black. We haven't talked about our different screen views just yet, but we'll get to those. We can, if we want to, have colors, highlighted colors inside our menus if we want. We have tooltips, again, when we're hovering over top of items inside our preferences, we can have a tooltip show up just like this, or when we're hovering over top of tools inside the toolbox, for instance. And here's another option as well. When we start working with multiple images, multiple files, the default is to open those documents as tabs. And again, you'll see how this plays out, but you might want to keep this guy kind of in mind as we start working with multiple files. Okay, good stuff. Let's head down to the next category. Once again, you can click on Next there on the right, or just click on File Handling there on the left. Photoshop always wants to save image previews whenever we're saving our files. It always wants to append the file extension. So if I'm saving out a JPEG, for example, and I haven't put .jpg on the end, well, Photoshop's going to do that for me, right? And it always wants to save as into the original files folder as well. Okay, wonderful. Let's go down to performance. Now here what I can do is I can set the amount of memory that Photoshop is using. So right now this could be a default, I'm not 100% sure, but the available RAM that I have, at least on this computer, is 2600 megabytes of RAM. And Photoshop's going to use 70% of that. So I'm not sure if the default is for Photoshop to always use 70% of the total RAM. But anyway, I can use this slider if I want to adjust that, right? And obviously, the more memory I commit to Photoshop, the faster Photoshop's going to run, right? Or, I could certainly drop that down if I want to commit less system resources to Photoshop. I'm going to leave the default here, though, which is the 70% there. You can certainly adjust yours if you want. The other thing that I want to mention is in the previous exercise, or maybe it was a few exercises back, I mentioned history, and I called history the Uber undo. Well, what I can do here is I can set the number of history states. Now, I'm assuming that you're not familiar with history, so what we can do here essentially is we can think of this as the number of undos. So the default is 20. I could bring that up to 25 if I want, I suppose, or I could drop that down to maybe 10 or 15, something like this. And that's the number of undos, or the number of states that Photoshop is going to allow me to back up. So anyway, I'm going to leave the default here, but you can certainly adjust that once again, as always. And then below that, we have scratch disks. Now, if I had any external hard drives, I do have some external hard drives, but they're not hooked up to my machine right now. I could set those as scratch disks. Now, what that means is once Photoshop blows through the available RAM, it's going to start using hard drive space as memory. So it's going to start by using my Macintosh hard drive, and then it would start using any external drives that I have. So let's say I'm working on a huge file, maybe 150 meg or a 250 meg file. Well, that's going to require a lot of memory to get through, right? So what I could do is I could come in here and set up some additional scratch disks. So hopefully all good. Now, I'm going to leave the preferences here. I'm going to leave it at this point, and we'll continue on with our walk through the different preferences in the next lesson. Okay, in the previous exercise, we got started taking a look at Photoshop's preferences, and in this exercise, we'll finish off our walk through the Photoshop preferences. So we just finished talking about the performance category here. I'm going to head down now to cursors. Now, as soon as we start working with the different Photoshop tools that we have available to us, we will get different cursors showing up on screen. So we have our painting cursors, and we have other cursors, basically two categories here. And what we can do is we can decide on the cursor that we want to have display inside our document. Maybe you're sitting here going, well, who cares? What's the big deal? But some people like to come in here and set this up. Now, I usually leave the normal brush tip, and this is the preview that we would have there. Now, what I like about the normal brush tip is as I increase my brush size, the cursor is also going to increase in size. And you'll see this later on, but maybe instead I want to switch to precise, which is going to give me this crosshair, or standard, which gives me just the tool icon itself. So again, it's entirely up to you. I'm just going to stick with the normal brush tip here, and same goes for the other cursors as well. You can go standard or precise. It's really up to you. Okay, wonderful. Let's head down to transparency and gamut. The default transparency view, or the default manner in which Photoshop indicates transparency to us, is with this gray and white checkerboard pattern. And I would highly recommend that you leave the default here, because most Photoshop users leave the default. And if you're working with coworkers who are also running Photoshop, you go and change yours. That could cause confusion when you're communicating between each other. But anyway, you can come in here and change it if you want. You can change your grid colors if you want. If you want green and white or orange and white, or you can go and customize the actual colors that are being used by clicking on these color swatches. And then below that we have our gamut warning, and there's the default color there, this darker gray color. Okay, let's kind of speed things up here and finish things off. Units and rulers. I'm going to make sure that my unit of measurement, for whatever reason, Photoshop has defaulted to centimeters here for myself anyway. I'm going to make sure that I'm on inches. That's a little bit easier to use, at least here in North America. My unit of measurement for type, I'm going to make sure that's set to points as well. Below that, we have guides, grid, and slices. I'm going to leave all the defaults here, but my guides, the default color for guides is cyan. Smart guides is magenta. We'll talk about working with guides and working with your grid a little bit later on, but there's our color for our grid, which is currently set to a custom color. I'll leave that, and we can set up the grid lines and the subdivisions there as well. Really quickly here, if we have any additional plugins, one of the great things about Photoshop is we can extend the capabilities of Photoshop by adding in some plugins, perhaps plugins from Alien Skin, or I mean there's a lot of third-party vendors that are creating some amazing plugins. So we can come in here and specify our additional plugins folder, go and browse for it and set it up that way. I'll just cancel out of all that. And then finally we have type, use smart quotes, enable missing glyph protection, and so on. And then last but not least, we have 3D. So if you want to get into working with some of the 3D options here inside Photoshop. So I know it was brief. I know we didn't go through every single possible option inside the preferences. But again, if we were to do that, you would be fast asleep and I would be babbling on about things that really don't enhance the way that we're going to work with Photoshop on an everyday usage. So again, as we go along, I may pop into the preferences and change a few things up. But I think for now, we'll stick with the defaults. I did change my unit of measurement there. I think that was the only setting that I changed. I went from centimeters to inches. But other than that, I think we are good to go here. So go ahead and click on OK. That locks in any changes that you made, and we are good to go from here. Okay, let's have a look at creating new documents. Now, we'll talk about opening files in just a bit, but what I'm referring to is creating brand new blank documents inside Photoshop. And this is really handy to know whether you're creating perhaps a photo montage of some sort, or maybe you want to start creating some components for your website or your blog, perhaps a header or some kind of a graphical component. Usually it always starts inside the new document dialog box. So whether you're on Mac or PC, the process is exactly the same. Head to the File menu and then very first option there, New, or you can whack Control-N or Command-N on your keyboard if you like your keyboard shortcuts. Either way, you'll wind up inside this dialog box. Now, right up at the top of this dialog box, you can give your document a name if you want. I could call this Jeff's new file, or perhaps blog header or photo montage or something like that. Now, this is optional. You don't have to give your file a name if you don't want to. When you go to save your file, you'll be prompted for a file name anyway. And then below that, what we can do is we can choose a document preset, default Photoshop size, or we could go US paper or photo or web, film and video, and so on, or we could go custom if we want. I have to be honest though, these first two options I never use. What I do is I come into width and height, I pop in my values, I set my resolution and my color mode, I hit OK, and I'm off to the races. So that's usually how I do it anyway. Maybe that's a little bit old school, I don't know, but the first thing that I'm going to do though is I'm going to make sure that my unit of measurement is set to inches here. I'm assuming that this is going to be a print document, or what I could do is I could go with pixels if I were building something for the web. Let's do that instead, actually. I'm going to go with pixels. And what I'll do is, let's imagine that we're going to set up a web header, either for a blog or for a website. Well, I'm going to set my width here, the maximum width, which is 960 in web design circles. I don't want to design anything any larger than that. So 960 is the width. The height, let's say 100 pixels for the height there. The resolution, now this is going to lead us down a deep dark path if I'm not careful. I'm going to make sure that my resolution is set to pixels per inch, and I want to make sure that my resolution is just 72. So 72 pixels per inch. That's the default resolution for anything that's going to be viewed on screen, whether it's a PowerPoint presentation or a website banner header like you and I are designing here. And then the color mode, I'm going to make sure my color mode is set to RGB, or red, green, and blue. Again, anything that's viewed on screen is going to be in the RGB color space. If I were designing anything for print, then I would go with CMYK or cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, the CMYK color space. But again, just make sure you're on RGB for now. The background contents, I'm going to make sure I'm set to white. So in other words, my blank document is going to show up as a blank white document. If you want, you can go into advanced here. You can set your color profile, and you can also adjust your pixel aspect ratio. This gets into if you do any video work, any video editing and things like this, you can come in here and set up your pixel aspect ratio. I'm designing for the web though, of course, so I'm going to stick with square pixels. And as a matter of fact, I'll go and collapse this advanced section here. And then from there, all I'm going to do is click on OK, and that's really all there is to it. We're now ready to roll. We're ready to start building our mock-up here for our website or our blog. So that's really all there is to setting up a new document. Again, it's just File and then down to New, and then I throw in my width, my height. I make sure I'm on the correct unit of measurement, my resolution, and then I click on OK, and that's all there is to it. Now that we have a blank file created here inside Photoshop, obviously the next thing that we would do is we would open up some additional images and drop them inside this graphic that we've created, this new document that we've created, or we could start designing buttons if this truly is going to be something that's going to wind up on our blog or our website. But before we get to all that stuff, I mean, that's down the road a little bit, right? I've got to kind of give you a tour of this document interface that we have. So this new sort of area, this new interface that we have that's occupying the Photoshop area or the Photoshop workspace. So right up at the top, what we have is what's referred to as the document tab. And what I see on the document tab is the name that I gave my file, which was Jeff's new file. And then I see an @ symbol and a percentage there. What that means is that's the current zoom level that I'm presently set at. So we'll talk about zooming and navigating in just a bit, but that's the current zoom setting. And at a glance here, I can tell that I have an RGB image, so it's made up of red, green, and blues, and I have an 8-bit image as well. Now, getting into bit depths is a little bit off the deep end, but at a glance anyway, I can tell that I have an RGB image and it's 8-bit. Okay, great. And then down towards the bottom, I have, well, bottom left corner, we have a zoom field. Again, I get that zoom percentage there, 66.67%. So that's my current zoom level. And then if I move my eye over towards the right just a little bit, I get the document size. So this file is taking up just under 300K in terms of file size. Now what's neat here is this little area here is actually a little message area. I've got this menu here that I can actually flip into, and I can decide what information, what content I want to have appear inside this little area here. So for example, what I could do is I could switch to current tool, and now it says move because I presently have the move tool activated inside my toolbox. I go and switch to my marquee tool, and now it reads rectangular marquee. Now that's all fine and well. You can leave it on that, I suppose, if you want, but usually myself, I just leave it on document sizes. You can change that if you want. No big deal. Now, I want to show you a neat little trick, and of course, as we go along during our time together, I want to throw in as many neat little tricks and techniques as I can. So I have a neat trick here for you that I want to show you. So what I'm going to have you do is if you're on the Windows side, hold down the Alt key. If you're on the Mac platform, hold down your Option key and then click on this little message area here. As a matter of fact, click and hold with your mouse, because if you just click, then you'll see that little flash show up there. So click and hold with your mouse, and I now get this little information box coming up. So it tells me the width, 960 pixels. So I get the pixels and the inches, although I don't really care about the dimensions in terms of inches because I'm building something for the web. So it's 960 pixels in width, 100 pixels in height. It's 3 channels, so it's RGB, it's 8-bit, and my resolution is 72 pixels per inch. So there you go. A neat little thing that you can do. So, go ahead and open up a photo that you might have on your computer, or, next time someone emails you a photo, open it up inside Photoshop, hold down Alt if you're on the Windows side, hold down Option here on the Mac, and click and hold on this little area, and you can get some detailed info about the graphic that you're working on. Is it suitable for the web? What's the resolution? And so on and so forth. Neat little trick inside Photoshop. Photoshop can open a huge array of graphic file formats. As a matter of fact, I can almost guarantee that Photoshop's going to open up pretty much any file format that you can throw at it, from TIFFs and GIFs to vector file formats like Adobe Illustrator files and PDFs and all the rest of it. So here's what I'm going to do here with you. I want to open up a file and I want to show you a couple of neat things here. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to choose File and then Open, or Control-O on the Windows side, or Command-O here on the Mac. And of course that brings us into the Open dialog box. And I'd like you to navigate to your Project Files folder, which hopefully you copied onto your desktop. And I'm going to go and open up a file called Barn1. You can really grab any file you want. It doesn't really matter, just so long as we have something to open up here. And then go ahead and click on Open inside the dialog box there. There's our barn, or whatever image that you decided to open up. Okay, wonderful. Now earlier when we were taking a look at Photoshop's preferences, there was an option in there for opening your files as tabs. So now what I have at the top of my Photoshop interface is barn1.jpg. I can tell my zoom level right now is 25%. It's an RGB image and it's 8-bit. It's an 8-bit image. And you know, if I really want, I could hold down Option or Alt on the Windows side and then click on this little area down at the bottom of the image window and get some additional information about this file. For instance, this guy is huge. He's 2,500 pixels in width, or 35.5 inches. He's 1,920 pixels in height, or 26.5 inches. He's RGB, and he's 72 pixels per inch. So he's pretty massive. He's pretty huge in terms of his physical dimensions anyway. That's kind of a cool thing. But you may have eyeballed this already, that I still have the original file that you and I created open inside the previous tab. So now I'm working in sort of this tabbed environment here, which you might like or you might not like. Personally myself, maybe I'm a little old school when it comes to Photoshop, but I don't like the tabs. I like instead having floating document windows. So what I'm going to do here is up to my application bar running right across the top here. We have this drop down right here, Arrange Documents. And what I can do here, I mean, you can choose all kinds of different ways to view your files if you want. We could go 2 up, for instance, and now we get side by side, or, you know, I could drop this guy down and I could go, you know, 1 above, 1 below, something like this, which is kind of cool. I mean, this is great when you're doing, you know, comparison work and things like this. But instead, I think what I'll do is I'll pop open this menu up on the application bar, and instead what I'll do is I'll say Float All in Windows. And now what I have is a separate document window for each of my Photoshop files, and I can drag them around just by dragging on this title bar here. And you'll notice that there's no longer a document tab running across the top, but I still get the same information. Barn1, there's the zoom level, there's my color space and my bit level as well. So I'm still getting all the same information, and I have the exact same information running right across the bottom of the document window. So it really is entirely up to you how you'd like to work. If you want to go back to that tabbed interface, that tabbed view, you can head back up to your application bar, back to Arrange Documents, drop this guy down here and choose the very first icon there, Consolidate All, and now we're back to where we started. Pretty cool. So there you go. There's opening files and working with multiple files and things like this. Now, before I close this out here, I want to show you one more thing here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to close out of these 2 files here just by clicking on the X there on the document tab. For each of these guys here, I'm going to close out of this guy as well. And if you get prompted to save or anything like that, just say no. And I want to show you a very cool way for opening up files, both on the Mac and on the PC side. What we could do, of course, is we could choose File Open, or we could hit Control-O on the Windows side, or Command-O here on the Mac. But try this. This gray background that we see here in the sort of the background of the Photoshop interface, try double-clicking on it. That's a super fast way to get to your open dialog box. Do you want to see that one more time? All I did is this gray background here, just double click on it anywhere. Double click anywhere on it, throws you into the open dialog box, grab the file that you want, click on open. That's all there is to it. That's probably one of my most favorite Photoshop tricks or Photoshop techniques. So there you go, opening files and working with multiple files. earlier you saw how we could increase our screen real estate either by hitting the tab key on our keyboard or holding down shift and hitting tab. Kind of cool. But I want to show you a couple of different ways to further expand the real estate that we have on screen when we're working inside Photoshop. We have some different Photoshop screen modes, and there's a few different ways to access these different screen modes, but the way that I'm going to show you here, at least initially, is from the application bar running right across the top of your interface. So once again, head up to the application bar, and it's this fella here, this screen mode drop-down menu that we're after. So go ahead and pop this guy open. You should be inside the standard screen mode option, but what I'm going to do here with you is I'm going to go ahead and flip over to full screen mode with menu bar. Go ahead and choose that option there. And now we're inside this full screen mode, but also with the menu bar there running across the top of the interface. Kind of cool. And then what I'll do is I'll grab this screen mode drop-down menu one more time, and I'll choose full screen mode this time, the very last option. And this time we're presented with a bit of a Photoshop warning here. It says, in full screen mode, the panels are hidden. They can be accessed on the sides of the screen or revealed by pressing the tab key. While in full screen mode, you can return to the standard screen mode by pressing the F key on your keyboard or by hitting escape. All right, sounds like fun. Let's hit full screen and see what happens. Okay, so we wind up inside this full screen mode. I'm not sure if you remember this or not, but when we were touring through the preferences there very quickly, we had some different color options for the full screen mode, and then with the full screen mode with the menu bar, I think it was gray was the default for that one, and black now is the default for the full-on screen mode. Now, what's cool about this is all of the techniques that I've shown you up until this point work. So in other words, I could hit the P key on the keyboard to access the pen tool, or the V key to access the move tool, or, you get the idea, M for marquee, and, all the rest of it. So kind of cool. So all the different techniques that we've seen, the shortcuts and so on, work inside this full screen mode. And this is a great mode to work in. Like, you might be sitting there going, well, what's the big deal? When am I going to use this? Well, if you're doing a lot of color correction or, correction in terms of fix-ups on your photographs and things like this, it's a fantastic mode to work inside. And as that warning had instructed me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my cursor over towards the right edge of my screen, and as I touch the right edge of my screen, bang, there's my palettes. They fly out from the right-hand side. So now I can go and I could perhaps set up my layers or adjust some of my channels and so on. And then as soon as I move my mouse away, all of the panels disappear once again on the right-hand side. Tap over to the right-hand side of the screen there and they reappear. Kind of a neat thing, right? And the same goes for the toolbox that we have over on the left-hand side. If I just bring my mouse over and tap the left edge of my screen, there's my toolbox. So I can go and I can grab a different tool, maybe my dodge, maybe my smudge or my eraser or whatever, bring the tool away back over onto my photo, and then the toolbox disappears again. Pretty cool. Go ahead and hit escape on your keyboard, and that'll bring you back into your regularly scheduled Photoshop. Kind of a cool thing. So you can certainly use this drop-down menu here, this view drop-down menu here on your application bar. Or let me show you this. This is usually what I do, is I just hit the F key on my keyboard. So hit it once, now we're inside the full screen with the menu bar. Hit it one more time, now we're back into that full screen mode. So this is just the F key all by itself. So F then takes me back to where I started. This is standard, full screen with menu, full screen. Kind of cool. Okay, I have held off long enough. I gotta show you how to navigate around inside your images and how to get around inside the different files that you'll have inside Photoshop. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to start off nice and simple for you, and then I'm going to get things, I'll sort of speed up as we go along, and I'll get things really happening here for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by grabbing the zoom tool way down at the bottom of the toolbox, the little magnifying glass tool there. Go ahead and hit your Z key on your keyboard if you so wish. And now I have this zoom tool here, and if I want to zoom in on my image, all I need to do is simply single click on the area that I want to zoom in on. So say I want to zoom in on this sort of this gaping hole in the back of the barn. Something like that, right? That's really all there is to it. It's pretty easy stuff. Now, once you're zoomed in, How the heck do you zoom back out? Well, what I'm going to do here is on the Mac side here, I'm going to hold down the Option key. On the Windows side, go ahead and hold down Alt. And when you have that modifier key held down, either Option or Alt, you'll notice that the plus inside your cursor changes to a minus, suggesting that if you were to single click now with either Alt or Option held down, you would zoom out. Kind of cool. So Photoshop gives us tons of different ways to zoom in and out. This is probably the easiest way. Let's say I'm going to go after one of these windows here. Just single clicking on that area there will zoom me in. And of course, as I zoom in, I start to see those pixels. We talked about that earlier. I'll hold down Option here on the Mac or Alt on the Windows side, single click to get me all the way back out. Kind of cool. Okay. Wonderful. This is one way to zoom in on my image. I'm just going to scroll up here a little bit and kind of recenter my drafty barn. Okay, is there another way to zoom in on my drafty barn? You betcha. There's tons of different ways. Let's say, for example, I want to zoom in on this right-hand window here. I could single click on it 50,000 times to zoom all the way in on it if I wanted to. Or what I could do is simply click and drag with the zoom tool. And before I let go, what happens here is as I click and drag, obviously I draw out a rectangle of what I call anyway marching ants. So I now have these marching ants sort of surrounding my right hand window. If I let go with my mouse, it snaps me right in on that rectangle, right in on that area. Pretty cool. If you want to see that one more time, I'm going to hold down Option or Alt here and I'll zoom all the way back out. Let's say, for example, this time I'm going to go after the left-hand window here down in the foundation of the drafty barn. Once again, click and drag all the way around that object, let go, zoom all the way in. That's all there is to it. It's pretty easy. Pretty cool stuff. All right. Now, let me show you a couple of other things here. I'm going to zoom back out here, all the way back out, maybe something like that. Okay, and what I'm going to do, I want to show you some shortcuts here. I want to kind of speed it up a little bit. This is the slow way to zoom, by the way. I'm going to go back to my Move tool inside my toolbox, the black arrow tool there. Let's say, for example, I want to zoom in on my image, but I don't want to switch off of the tool that I'm currently on, whether it's the Move tool or, any of the other tools that I have available to me. Give this a try. On the Mac side, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the Command key and the space bar simultaneously. If you're on the Windows side, hold down the Control key and the space bar simultaneously. And your cursor switches to the Zoom tool, to the magnifying glass tool. As soon as you let go of your keyboard, you're back onto the black arrow tool. You're back onto the Move tool. So holding down Command and spacebar or Control and spacebar there on the Windows side temporarily accesses the Zoom tool. Does that make sense? This is what we call a toggle, and it's a really awesome way to work. So in other words, I'm working along inside Photoshop, doing my thing. I go, I got to zoom in on this guy. Control spacebar or Command and spacebar, click and drag, zoom in on the area that I want to work on, let go of my keyboard, and then keep going to town on my image. And then check this out. I now want to zoom out. So I'm going to go Command and spacebar or Control and spacebar there on the Windows side, and then throw in Option here on the Mac or Alt on the Windows side. So now what I have held down is Command, spacebar, and Option here on the Mac at least, or on the Windows side it's going to be Control, spacebar, and Alt. Don't let your hand cramp up on you. And then notice that the magnifying glass tool now has the minus inside it. Single click to zoom all the way back out. Something like that. Pretty cool. Let go of your keyboard, give your hand a rest, and you're all the way back to the Move tool. Very cool stuff. Okay, awesome. This is kind of a first look anyway at zooming in and out on your images. I've got a bunch of other things to show you, and let's take a look at some additional zooming and navigation techniques coming up next. Okay, let's have a look at some additional techniques for navigating around inside your images. What you could also do, I suppose, if you really wanted to, is, I already pointed this out, but way down in the bottom left corner of your interface, we have this percentage field. So if you wanted to, you could type in some kind of a percentage, like, for example, 150, and then hit enter, and that zooms me into 150%, right? Or I could, I could back that off to say 75% or something like this, right? You can certainly do that. Or you can use the zoom drop-down menu, which is found on the application bar running right across the top of the Photoshop interface. That's perfectly fine as well. I find these methods kind of slow, though. In any regard, lots of different ways to zoom in and out, and I've got a couple of other techniques I'll show you in just a moment. But what I'm going to do now is I want to kind of switch the conversation over to talking about navigating around inside your image. So make sure you're zoomed in a little bit on your photograph. I'm here at 75%. You can zoom in a little closer if you want. And in terms of actually getting around inside the image, I have a few different options here. what I could do, for example, is I could use my scroll bars here, the vertical scroll bar and the horizontal scroll bar running right across the bottom of my image. But the only time I actually use my scroll bars is when I'm actually showing this inside some training like this. I never actually use it in the real world. So let me show you what you can do as well. Is just above the zoom tool there in the toolbox, we have the hand tool. Go ahead and grab your hand tool or hit your H key on your keyboard. And now what I can do is I can literally click and drag inside my image, which is awesome. It's 10 times faster than using your scroll bars. You'll move around a lot faster, right? But I gotta say this, even doing this is kind of slow. Let me show you a much faster way to use your hand tool. What I'd like you to do is hit the V key on your keyboard. That'll switch you back to your move tool. And then give this a try. Try holding down your spacebar, just your spacebar all by itself. And what that does is that temporarily toggles you to the hand tool. So Control and spacebar, or here on the Mac, Command spacebar grabs the zoom tool. The spacebar just by itself grabs the hand tool. So oftentimes what I'll do is I'll hit Control spacebar or Command spacebar, zoom in on an area, let go, I'm back onto my tool. I'll do a little fix up, hold down the space bar, pan around a little bit, continue my fix ups, this kind of thing, right? It might seem kind of tough if you've never done this before, but it's like anything. The more you do it, the more it goes on autopilot. When I'm actually working inside Photoshop, I don't even think about what I'm doing. I'm just, and I'm rocking away inside Photoshop, not even really paying attention to exactly what keys my fingers are holding down because I've done it for years, right? I don't even really think about it anymore. So anyway, some cool techniques there for you in any regard. All right, now I've got to show you a couple of other things. I hope you like your keyboard shortcuts because I'm going to blast you through a series of keyboard shortcuts here. Try this. If you're on the Windows side, hit Control-0, or if you're on the Mac side, as I am, hit Command-0. Now make sure you don't hit Command-O or Control-O. That's your open, right? If you hit Command-0 or Control-0, that'll zoom you all the way out. So now our document fits inside our screen, right? So that's kind of a cool shortcut for zooming all the way out. Try this. If you're on the Windows side, hold down Control, Mac, hold down Command, and try using your plus key to zoom in or your minus key to zoom out. That's another neat technique there that you can certainly make use of. So Control or Command plus to zoom in, Control or Command minus to zoom out, and Control or Command 0 to fit your document into your interface, which is awesome. There you go. Lots of cool techniques. I'm going to throw one more quick thing at you here. If you so choose to use this, we have something called the Navigator palette. I'm going to head up to my window menu here, and then I'm going to look for Navigator, I guess about 2/3 of the way down, I suppose. Look for Navigator. And what this guy will do, I'm just going to tear him away so we can have a sort of a closer look at this guy here. This fella right here, as the name implies, allows us to navigate around inside our image. This is yet another technique. I don't use this palette myself. It's a little too slow for me, but can certainly make use of it if you like. Running across the bottom, we have this slider, which allows us to zoom in and zoom out. You can certainly use that guy, or you can click on the little mountain to zoom out, or click on the big mountains to zoom in. And what's kind of cool here is as you zoom in, you'll notice in this little preview thumbnail here, we have this red frame, and the red frame indicates what we can currently see inside our document window, and I can actually drag on that red frame. And I apologize, by the way, for ripping through this, super fast, but we've got a lot of good stuff to get to, so I'm just trying to give you at least a half-decent idea of how the Navigator palette works. But again, myself, I don't use it. I rely on keyboard shortcuts instead, and if you're sitting there going, I can never remember keyboard shortcuts, put a sticky note on the bottom of your monitor, and, I guarantee within a week you'll have them all memorized, all these shortcuts that I was showing you, the Controller Command plus, Controller Command minus, and the Controller Command 0. So there you go. And don't forget, we have spacebar if we're zoomed in here. Hold down our spacebar there. Control or Command spacebar to zoom in. Control or Command spacebar and Alt or Option to zoom out. So lots of good stuff for you there to practice.